Hey, folks, it's that time of the week again. It's a time for another Getting to Know Dynatrace session. My name is David Jones. Everyone calls me Jonesy. Feel free. We're here today to talk about Dynatrace, and we're going to talk about some, as we always do, some. We'll go through the what's new at Dynatrace segment. We'll talk about the did you know, and then we're going to get things off to the best part of Dynatrace, which the getting to know sessions, which is the actual demonstration. And this week we've got Ben Styx with us. Ben's going to be leading us through the demonstration. Ben, I got to tell you, that name just rocks, bud. I thought, David Jones, that's all right. If you're in Australia, you got kind of a cool name. But Ben Styx, that name sticks anywhere. Oh, sorry, bad puns. I just can't help myself. Can't help myself. So listen, let's get into this. And as always, folks, please. The reason that these sessions are so useful and so much fun is because of your questions. So as we get into the demonstration, make sure, no matter what social channel you have, ask questions. Go ahead, fire those questions in there, and Ben or myself will be able to do our best to either answer them or at least point you in the right direction. So with that, let's get going. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And let's get into the first segment of this week's Getting to Know Dynatrace, which is what's new. So, as with all of these segments, honestly, folks, you really want to know what's new at Dynatrace, you got to go check out our blog site. Check out our news and our blog site. Look at our release notes. We always talk about all of the different things that are going on at Dynatrace. And, we mention this all the time. Here at Dynatrace, innovation is what we do. We're so focused on innovation. We are releasing new capabilities into the Dynatrace platform every 2 weeks. So twice a month, you're getting new capabilities, new functionality. There's going to be new updates. So always keep on top of those release notes. But again, the blog has got great content in it, and I highly recommend that you take the opportunity to go through the blog and have a look at some of the stuff that we're publishing out there. As a matter of fact, let's flip over into the blog site right now, and let me just get this up on the screen here so everyone can see it. So much stuff floating around everywhere. So some of the things that are new that I would point you to, like right now, hot off the presses, is this 2022 ESG report, which talks about cloud native applications, leading modern IT strategies. And this, in this particular case, this article, it goes through and describes, some of the challenges that modern IT, applications really have, and what, what those observability challenges are, and we do talk in certain circumstances about some of the different things that Dynatrace can do to mitigate those issues. There's some other blog articles here, like some of this content is actually coming to us from recorded sessions from our Perform conference. I know that because this one right here I actually participated in this. That's my ugly mug right there, so sorry about that. I apologize that you have to look at that, but the content is actually really cool. We talked about a lot of really interesting things during that session. I think you'll get a lot out of it. You can see here that I talked about our approach to innovation, how we're constantly pushing out new capabilities. Well, we got blog articles here to talk about new capabilities that are being pushed out into our managed deployment model, as well as what we're deploying out onto our SaaS platform as well. I want to take a moment and actually drill into this article. This article here is about how SAP is accelerating their ServiceNow adoption with Dynatrace. And the reason I wanted to bring this up was I actually had a call this morning with an organization that is using ServiceNow, and they were thinking to themselves that, hey, you know what, ServiceNow is just this great ITSM ITOM platform, has a lot of like really interesting capabilities, and they wanted to know more about how Dynatrace could really sort of help them. I thought that was really timely that I was having that discussion this morning when we actually had released, last week, this blog article, which actually talks about how SAP right now is basically, they are supporting over 2.1 billion online shoppers with their platform, which is being monitored by Dynatrace. This is just one, shows the massive scalability of what Dynatrace has to offer, but more importantly, how Dynatrace really drives value out of ServiceNow. And that's everything from the ability for Dynatrace to detect problems and create ITSM tickets inside of ServiceNow, to being able to take our topology model and actually forward that topological information into ServiceNow so that you've got fresh CIs. So the CIs that you're working with inside of ServiceNow, they're constantly up to date. The relationship mapping between those CIs is accurate. And this is super important, because what that does is that means that when you're in ServiceNow and you're working those ITSM tickets, it allows you to basically be assured that the CIs that the ticket is associated with are fresh, are up to date, are in fact actually the components that we are looking into. And you take it one step further, and this blog article actually goes in and explains this in a little bit more detail. If you go through this, it actually explains a little bit further about how this is setting up the stage for an organization like SAP to use the answers that Dynatrace provides to let ServiceNow drive remediation and help self-healing routines within the SAP platform. So this is very exciting, very cool stuff. I highly, highly, highly recommend that if you have an opportunity, give this article a read. It literally just talks about how Dynatrace is just basically feeds this stream of answers to ServiceNow so that you get so much more value out of ServiceNow. Now it's time for the next segment. And the next segment inside of our Getting to Know Dynatrace session is Did You Know? So for this week's Did You Know, what we want to talk about is, did you know that Dynatrace provides database observability? So Dynatrace provides a really unique view into the database. Our Dynatrace OneAgent, you install the OneAgent on your hosts. The Dynatrace OneAgent, it instruments your applications. And what we do is really unique. We actually start doing some introspection at the JDBC and the ADO.NET level. That's geek talk for how you actually connect your application to your database. And for what we're doing is we're actually looking at how your application is calling the database. So without installing an agent on the server where your database resides, Dynatrace still provides visibility into how your application is calling that database. So we automatically detect all the databases that your application talks to, and you don't have to do any configuration to do that. You can see how those applications use those databases. It provides detailed metrics about every database statement that is coming from the application. And so this gives you just out of the box, immediate automatic insight into what's happening within your database. But also, we can connect to the databases directly, and we can pull in metrics from those database APIs. And that allows us to see even more about what's going on at that database level. So, folks, if you have, almost obviously almost all applications today, they run on top of some sort of database, and whether or not that database is being hosted in-house, on premise, in your on your own servers, or if that database is a service that's actually running within Amazon, or if it's running up in Azure, or if it's running on GCP. In any particular case, Dynatrace is still going to be able to provide you visibility into how your applications are communicating with those databases and what's happening inside of those databases. Absolutely, developers they absolutely love this type of visibility. One, it doesn't cost them anything from the standpoint of they don't have to do any hard instrumentation by hand to figure out what's going on. Dynatrace just observes what's going on. Then it allows you to identify scenarios like, for example, that classic, we call it in the industry, we use the term the classic N+1 problem. So imagine a developer, and developers are like anyone else. They're pressed for time. They take shortcuts sometimes. They just, think that, hey, this is a quick way for me to actually make a query to the database. What they may not take into account is that the way that they query that database might then be used by other parts of the application. And so what seems like a very simple sort of, I want to fetch this information out of the database once, all of a sudden now you see that call being made 10, 100, 1,000 times. And so now what looked to be a really sort of innocuous call to the database is a massive database performance issue. Dynatrace is perfect for being able to identify those types of scenarios, those types of issues. All right. So folks, that's the end of this week's Did You Know? And that's basically, did you know that Dynatrace does provide visibility down to the database level, including the database statements. With that, let's get on to the best part of today's session of getting to know Dynatrace, and that is it's demo time. And so I'm going to stop sharing, and we're going to send things over to Ben. So Ben, hey, Ben, welcome to Getting to Know Dynatrace. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we dive into the demo.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, my name is Ben. Last name is Styx, spelled like the band, or even the river out there in Greece, Greece mythology. So that's, always great to kind of show off there. I've been working with Dynatrace for about 7 years now, and started off here in the post-sale side as a guardian, helping deliver things on site back in our old Gen 2 days, back when we were at Atmon, working some of those older tools, and then kind of move over to our Dynatrace One support side a couple years later. Did that for about 3 years, and just started working on the sales side on the last year. So I started this back in September, and so I'm pretty fresh on this side, but very well versed in the Dynatrace world myself.
That's awesome. Well, we're happy to have you here, Ben. And, you've got that long pedigree of experience working with Dynatrace, working with customers, and working with Dynatrace. So that's absolutely fabulous. And look, we're already starting the session off, and we got questions already. Question here is, how long does it take for Dynatrace to monitor a company's infrastructure? Well, that's a really well-timed question, because we're going to start off with the demo, and Ben's actually going to show us how much time it actually takes for us to start getting visibility into a company's infrastructure. So with that question, and I didn't plant that question, let's get started, Ben. So over to you. Let's get into this demo.
Cool. Awesome. Sounds good. So this is the Dynatrace UI. This is what you might see when you first log in here, depending on what you have out there. So this is just kind of a dashboard showing you the breadth of things that you could show on one page here when you first log in, or when somebody wants to share a page. You could see all this level of detail here. These are very customizable, so there's a lot you can show with them. But that's kind of enough about dashboards. Let's just dive into how you actually deploy this and how quickly you can actually see things. So to do this, I'll start off here by going to the Dynatrace Hub. And this is a great way to kind of show all of the technologies out there that Dynatrace support. So you'll see here, this is showing about 500 different technologies that we support within Dynatrace. And if you're looking for something in particular, say you have something out there in AWS, we can just type that here and see all the different technologies we do support for those. And we can actually just dive into each of these and start going through that deployment process. So this is a great way to kind of get started. But for most types of installations you would probably start off with the OneAgent. So say you have a traditional host out there, whether it's somewhere out in the cloud or somewhere on premise, maybe you want to deploy this on top of your own server out there that you have locally. You can go ahead and do this using the OneAgent. So we'll just go ahead and download the OneAgent itself right here. And for a Linux host, we'll go ahead and follow this process. There's a link here for that. Once this page does load there. So we'll see different types of operating systems we can install this on. And for Linux, this is just 3 commands to actually do the installation itself. And if you notice here, the first 2 commands are actually wget commands. The first one is the actual installation or the download of that package. The second one is just verification that the package was downloaded successfully. And the third command here is the actual installation itself. So that's all there is needed to install Dynatrace on the host and start monitoring it. As soon as you install this on there, it will start monitoring that host, and it's going to start sending data back to Dynatrace, and you can see it here in real time. So it's very quick, almost instantaneous as soon as you deploy this out there. And this is a huge change from the way we used to do things, especially back when I first started working here, when we had our old Gen 2 solution, which was Dynatrace Atmon. With that, back in the day, you had to find your command line arguments, your start scripts, to see where you can actually insert your agent parameter for maybe your Java processes, .NET was kind of a different process as well to make sure you're instrumenting that. And this was kind of a painstaking effort in the past. You had to stay up late after work each day to actually do the installation, find someone who can actually make the change within the startup script itself, and figure out where that even is that we can actually add that parameter in there. So this change is just magical, basically, to be able to do this automatically without actually having to find those parameters. It will do this all on its own as you restart your processes.
It is really different from the way that the industry used to approach this. Basically having to go out and mess around with config.properties files, or having to go into all of those different configurations, and having Dynatrace just do this for you automatically. We had so many comments from people saying, wow, this is really sort of game changing when we're trying to lay down our monitoring solution. What I find is, Ben, is that a lot of our more mature customers, what they do is they actually take the agent, they bake it into their machine images. So when they spin up a new VM, the agent's already there. And as soon as the agent goes live, it starts sending telemetry back to the Dynatrace cluster. And in that scenario, it's like zero touch, and you're starting to get instrumentation and visibility from your applications and infrastructure.
That's awesome. Yep, that's a great use case. That's a great way to install us out there. It's very automated. There's nothing you really need to do is once it's actually deployed as part of that there. So that's awesome that you can do that. Even something like Kubernetes, you can deploy this at the whole cluster and instantly see kind of your health of that Kubernetes cluster, all the different pods out there, and see how healthy they all are out there.
So we got, before you get too deep into the demonstration, we've got some more questions. This is awesome. Mm-hmm. So we've got questions just coming in, and this question here is from Edward, and he's asking, has Dynatrace been used to provide data center compute efficiency, or DCCE, touted as a logical DCOI metric from the folks at Green Grid? So here's the interesting thing. Now, I don't know off the top of my head no, I do know, because I've not worked on any projects that have specifically, asked for that particular requirement. But that being said, I've got a pretty good idea as to what we're talking about. And so one of the really unique things about Dynatrace is that when it comes to understanding the efficiency of your compute, we can allow organizations to basically trend out the CPU performance that is happening at the host level. And so that would be not only your physical host, but the host of your VM, the underlying hypervisor. Even if you're running your applications in containers, we're going to provide CPU, visibility into the CPU consumption there. And we take it even one step further. So the processes that are running within those containers, we allow you to actually see the CPU usage for those. And one more thing is that we would allow organizations to be able to understand all the way down to the specific method in terms of what methods are chewing up CPU. So the reason for that, Edward asked a really great question. The reason those metrics are important for answering Edward's question is that Dynatrace provides visibility from all the way up at the high level, all the way down to the very lowest level, most common denominator, that being the actual methods that are executing the code. So if I'm thinking about power consumption, if I'm thinking about things from the standpoint of green computing, having the visibility that Dynatrace provides allows organizations to really fine tune how their applications are performing, how even down specific modules of code are consuming CPU. So that's a fabulous question. Thank you very much for that, Edward. Christina, thank you for the question. How many technologies do we support? Well, so I get that, from time to time, as part of our role, Ben and I, we answer what's called an RFP, or request for proposal. We do this all the time, and we get that question all the time. And basically what happens is we have literally pages and pages and pages of technologies that we support. The Dynatrace Hub, as an example, we list on it over 500 different technologies that we support. So, Christina, thanks for that question. Dynatrace just has this immense breadth of visibility. But Great question. You know what? Let's get back to the demonstration. I interrupted Ben. So Ben, back to you. So you showed us how easy it is to install an agent. What happens after we install the agent?
That's a great question. So as soon as you install it, Dynatrace is going to automatically start monitoring those hosts, those processes out there. And it's going to take all this information and bring it into what we call the Smartscape top out. And we can access this over here on the left-hand side by going over to our Smartscape. And what this is doing is it's drawing out all the dependencies across all the applications, the processes, the monitored hosts out there to see in real time what resources are talking to which other resources out there. It's almost like a real-time CMDB of the environment basically out here. So we can focus in on certain services, certain processes, certain hosts, and really kind of see where they sit in with the rest of the infrastructure and what else they talk to. So I can see here we have this one service sitting on top of these 4 processes, on top of these 2 hosts here, out in AWS in this case. And we could follow this down into this vertical topology, go into these hosts and see what else is living on this host. So here's all of the other processes that this host has. And Dynatrace detects all of this in real time automatically as soon as it's deployed on those hosts. So there's no configuration to find all these processes out there to see these relationships. It's automatically seeing that this is out here. This host is talking to these other hosts out there. We see some traffic going between them. And these processes are living there on top of this host inside of this data center as well. So once it's deployed there, it's going to automatically start collecting metrics for the host health, for your process health, so your CPU usage, memory usage, some of those basic health metrics for the host, network health, disk health, even going into those process level metrics too as well, diving into your JVM health. Is there enough memory for the JVM? Does it have enough heap usage? Is there suspension time across there? What do the threads look like? Pulling in some JMX metrics to see how healthy some of those things are as well too. Diving beyond just is that CPU healthy in that process on that host, and seeing some of those health metrics across those. So as we dive up the services, this is where we start to actually see some of those transactions across this as well too. So we can dive into some of these services and see, how does the service relate to the rest of the infrastructure? Which processes does this sit on? And which other services does this call? So say you have some microservices out there that make some calls through other services, or even some sort of third-party service out there that you're not monitoring with Dynatrace. We're going to see those outbound calls to that as soon as it's making those calls to there and as soon as Dynatrace is deployed. So this is all done automatically as soon as Dynatrace is out here within the environment. And it's going to learn more about the environment as it starts to see more details here across it. So at the services level, we're tracking those response times for those transactions, those throughputs, those failure rates across all those individual calls. It's baselining all these calls as well too. So it's learning how your application performs, what's the expected behavior of this, and tying this back to the business as well too with your application layer. So with applications, we can track this back to end users. So we have each individual application. We can see all the different services that are supporting the application, as well as the processes, the hosts, the data centers this lives on to as well too. So you can see here that this one in particular is supported across Azure and AWS, all in this one view here, detected automatically by Dynatrace.
That's actually a great example, Ben. I hadn't seen that example before. I'm going to have to remember that one for future demos. That's a great example of just how a single application is sitting on top of a whole set of services. And in this case, it's sitting on top of a set of processes that are running on different hosts in different data centers. So if you have hybrid applications where part of the workload is on premise, part of the workload is up in Google, part of the workload is in Azure, part of it is in AWS, this just shows how Dynatrace, a single instance of Dynatrace, can easily support monitoring that complicated hybrid type environment. So we got a question. What makes Dynatrace different and or better than SolarWinds? So I don't often I don't often like talking about companies that do compete with a sliver of what we do. Now you'll notice that the nuanced way that I just answered that question. Remember, Dynatrace compared to something like SolarWinds. Dynatrace is a software intelligence platform. There are components of Dynatrace. Thanks for the call out there. Right on. Smartscape is dope. I love it. I want to quote you on that one. So, to answer that original question, Dynatrace, way it's different is we're a software intelligence platform. There are components of Dynatrace that look like an APM solution. There are components of Dynatrace that look like an infrastructure monitoring solution. There are components of Dynatrace that look like a real user monitoring solution. There are components of it that look like log monitoring. There are components of it that look like network monitoring. And we probably cover like 4 or 5 other different categories of solutions. And so what makes Dynatrace really unique is our breadth of visibility. And the fact is that our monitoring is not siloed and segmented to just infrastructure. We look at things as a whole. And the reason that we do that is because our AI loves data. That Davis AI, that AI engine that Dynatrace is built around, not layered on top, but built around, it needs data for it to arrive at answers. And the more data that we can feed it, and that underlying entity model that we have, which we see in this Smartscape, that underlying entity model that we see in the Smartscape really, sort of shows the difference between Dynatrace and simple infrastructure monitoring. Infrastructure monitoring is great. I've got a metric, and that metric is now out of whack. So we're going to throw up an alarm. But with Dynatrace, we can actually arrive at the root cause of the problem. And I think that's actually, Ben, I'm queuing you up because I think that's the next piece. The practical upshot of what everything that Ben just showed here with this Smartscape is that everything's being baselined, right? We're looking for errors. We're looking for exceptions. We're looking for performance bottlenecks. And our AI, when it discovers something, it does this. And Ben, I'm going to hand things back to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's taken all this data here and it's analyzing things in real time. And if there's some sort of issue somewhere, it's going to find all those problems and bring them together here into this page. So here's a list of some of the problems that it detected within this environment. I'm just going to go ahead and sort this list to find something that actually has a bit more of an impact here to see if we can find something that's a bit worth showing off here. So I'll go ahead and just grab one here. We can see here this problem is a bit larger. It had 10 affected components there. So I'll just wait for this to load here. I think my connection is just a bit slow. So this problem here is called vmware.easytravel.com, user action degradation. And right away, one of the things you can see here is that this problem is pulling in lots of different resources. We have, in this case, Davis analyzing the dependencies across 15,000 monitored entities across the whole environment. So something like this would be almost impossible to do on your own or very time consuming to do to see really where this problem lies, what the fault domain of this is, and which components are affected by this in this case. So there's a lot going on here, a lot of applications, a lot of affected services, infrastructure components. And I think really the best way to show this is this visual resolution path. With this visual resolution path, we can watch as a problem evolves, play this back and see which components were affected by this issue and how many components are involved in this particular problem. And I'll just go ahead and pause this while this is playing there to show that at this point in time, there are 32 different ongoing events within 10 different components that had some sort of issue within this problem. So we have some CPU saturation, we have some user actions that are showing a performance degradation. We have some service calls in the back end showing a slowdown as well too, across all these different services. So there's a lot of different components here. We have some infrastructure, end users being affected. So these could be users who could potentially be wanting to call in for their issues. And these could also be service calls in this case, showing this slowdown. So a lot of different components here. And in sort of the Gen 2 world of where we used to come from is that a lot of these issues would all be independent alerts. So in this case, we would have 32 different ongoing events. That's 32 alerts, or what we call an alert storm at this time period. So there's going to be a lot of people who are notified about this issue in sort of the Gen 2 way of looking at this. But Davis has brought in all these events, all of these issues across all these different components, whereas before you might have had separate tools to look at all these individual things. Remember, there's some infrastructure here, there's some service calls, some tracing, and there's also some end users affected here in this case too.
So,
And
Ben, I was just going to throw in here. I'm happy that you're walking us through this. There's guys on my team like Jason Bortolotti. He uses he describes this view in this way. So imagine you have a war room. What's the very first thing that happens in a war room type scenario? Somebody takes the marker and they go up to the whiteboard and they start drawing out how everything sort of talks to each other, right? And with Dynatrace, here it is. It's all mapped out for you automatically. There's no guessing. This is what was observed.
yeah, absolutely. And again, yeah, automatic. So there's no configuration needed. You don't need to bring in someone who knows about the application. In this case, I know almost nothing about this one. Dynatrace told me all this automatically as soon as we deploy this out there and as soon as it detected this problem. And when we go back to this problem card, it actually will even tell you the root cause of the issue and all the events, all the things that happened around this as well too. So we can correlate all these things together without having to find out, what happened during this time frame, go check through logs or see who else was involved here. In this case, we see there's this service here that had a response time degradation, and there's also some ESXi host CPU saturation. So it's correlating those metrics from VMware in this case to see that they just happened here on that ESXi host, and we could even track back some of these other issues as well too to see kind of what happened around this issue. So of course, this isn't the end of it. We point out the root cause for this case. We can go into the service and see some more issues around this and see what led up to this. But say you want to go back to the end users, we can trace this back to who was affected by this issue, which business transactions. So in this case, we see some user authentication for rental cars is having some sort of impact, the VMware Easy Travel application. And we can go back to those user sessions and see who these were and what issues they had across this, and who these users were for this particular issue. So here's some of those user sessions. So we have some usernames, some of these are anonymous, and we can even see kind of what happened there across all those user sessions. And if we have this enabled here, I see it's not enabled for this application, we can even play back those sessions and see what they experienced in their sessions. So these are users who had some sort of impact. Maybe they had some slowdown somewhere, maybe they had some sort of failures within that application. So here we see that this user has some load actions, some XHR actions, and some of these are showing some sort of failures or some sort of slowdown somewhere across that. And so we can tie this back to the business and see, where is this issue and how is this affecting end users. Right. And we can keep going with this, of course. We can dive into the waterfall for these user actions. So if I want to see some more details about this, we can see all the individual service calls that happened for this end user, trace this back to those peer paths as well. So this is in real time kind of seeing what this user saw when this page was loaded there. So we see for this particular user, how long the page took to load, the impact of all these third parties and CDN resources as well, and how this affected the end user's performance for the page. And you'll see some of these actually have a way of going down to the peer path as well too for these. So there's some requests here that failed, some that are a bit slower. They're in a time frame here as well too. Awesome. So I'm going to go back to our problem page and kind of show some more of this. So
Yeah,
we can do this for every user session. And
so actually, hold on a second, Ben. Let's just take a pause for a second because I've been seeing the comments sort of roll in. Thank you very much for the comments, people. For those folks who have had some experience with Dynatrace and thrown in the comments, please go ahead. Absolutely. And for the questions, keep them coming, folks. So here's a question, which is, what's the difference in data amount from the OneAgent and say the Appmon agent? So very interesting question. Now, let's go back, use the Wayback Machine. All right, I'm not going to try to do special effects ever again while we do this. But let's use the Wayback Machine and let's talk about Dynatrace Appmon. Prior to Dynatrace, our platform, we actually had a product called Dynatrace Appmon, which was a pure sort of Gen 2 APM solution, right? This is application performance monitoring. That's what it did. So probably the biggest difference between APM and the Appmon agent and the OneAgent is that the OneAgent is much more comprehensive. There's more to it. There are, and as a matter of fact, you know what, Ben? Let's show everyone. Let's go to a host and let's open up the processes on the host. Just do the complete process list and let's show them all the different components of the OneAgent. And I think this is actually, it allows us to have a really interesting discussion about what the OneAgent is, how it operates, and what it does. So let's just go into, anything that that's perfect. Let's go into that one.
Cool.
So we're going into a Linux machine here, and we're going to go to all processes. Yep. And now let's actually just sort on the process name. And here you can actually see that the OneAgent, it actually has a number of different modules. Now, some of these modules are optional, but basically we have something called, for example, the OneAgent monitoring extensions. Let's start there. OneAgent monitoring extensions is probably the closest thing that's analogous to the old Dynatrace Appmon APM agent. So a lot of the knowledge, all of that understanding, our experience of doing APM, that's all wrapped up in that monitoring extension, that process that you're looking at right now that we've got highlighted. But you can see there's a lot more that's going on with the OneAgent. So the OneAgent also includes a network monitoring component. It does a small amount of what we call PCAP or packet capture. There's also a component that's doing log monitoring. There's also a component that's doing system monitoring. So that's monitoring the underlying infrastructure. And you can see there's like now this extensions controller. There's a stats D component. So there's all of these different components to the agent. Now, the best thing about this is when you add up the performance impact of all of these different components, they rarely ever exceed more than, say, 2% of CPU in production. We spent a lot of time and effort to make sure that the agent runs in a very low overhead fashion, but provides just tremendous value in terms of giving you just a widest breadth of visibility. And so that, if you're looking at the difference between Appmon would really just be that monitoring extension piece. It's only looking at what's happening within the application and services layer. All of the other components of the OneAgent are looking at things like the network, like the logs, like the underlying system, extensions that we layer on top of that. So hopefully that answers your question about what's the difference between the Dynatrace OneAgent and Appmon. Here's a good question. Are there any restrictions that Dynatrace has when it comes to monitoring applications like an outdated OS? Yeah, absolutely, for sure. So typically what happens is Dynatrace will support for up to 6 months after a major OS gets in the industry, we use the term deprecated, so it's no longer supported. So when a specific version of an OS is no longer supported, we will support that for typically up to 6 months after it's been unsupported by that vendor, and then we no longer support it. That doesn't mean that you can't monitor it. It just means that our out-of-the-box functionality is not necessarily guaranteed for that, whatever that technology is. There are all sorts of different examples. Like, for example, I've had customers come to me and say, I've got applications that are running on Windows XP. And I'm like, what? It's like older than my kids. Yes, I am that old. I do have kids that old. But, okay, all right, I get that. That makes, hey, I see that happens. So in a scenario like that, how could we monitor something that's running on, say, like a really old version of Windows Server or Windows XP? In those scenarios, we can actually ingest metrics off of those older devices using things like the WMI frameworks. The WMI framework is essentially a set of metrics that can be generated directly from Windows that can be ingested into Dynatrace. On top of that, we support things like StatsD and Telegraph, which are agents that agent technologies that can run on legacy systems, and they can be used to feed telemetry into Dynatrace. So Old OSs, yeah, absolutely. After a period of time, we won't support them anymore, but that doesn't mean that they're officially unmonitorable. There's usually some other solution to monitor them. So thank you for that question. It's a great question. All right, Ben. So let's get back into the demo portion. You know what? If we go back into the problem card, why don't we talk a little bit more about the root cause analysis in this scenario? Can you walk us through that a little bit more in terms of, what we're seeing on the screen here, and maybe drilling down into some of the details that Dynatrace provides, other than just saying that, hey, this check destination service is causing the problem.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And there's a lot of different ways we can go into this too, right? So we looked at the front end impact on this. We can go down to the service itself. We can even go into this ESXi host that has a CPU saturation in this case. So let's start with that and just kind of go from there. So we see here in this case, these are all the events that are associated with this, by the way. So there's a lot of different other events that are correlated with this problem. So Davis found all these events automatically and saw that these are all part of this root cause in this case, all these different events associated with this. The ESXi VM impact has had this CPU saturation there in this process. So we could go into the process or go into the ESXi host and dive into this. So it's correlated all these events together here to show you in one page all the things that are contributing to this problem. So there's links here to the ESXi host. So we can go ahead and follow this down because we are integrated with VMware for this. So here on this ESXi host, we see here at the top of the page that Dynatrace did detect that this was part of the problem here in this case, and is actually identified as the root cause. So there's 100% CPU saturation on this ESXi host where that virtual machine lives for that check destination service in this case. And we can come down here and see, look at this crazy spike in the CPU saturation here. We can trace this down to the individual virtual machines. And from here, we can go ahead and see, at this time point right there, our average was about 24% across all these. So all these kind of put together there are the higher consumption of that there. So each of these individual hosts were consuming 24% of the CPU of that whole ESXi host. Yep. And then from here, we can go ahead and dive into each of these individual virtual machines as well too. So we can see what's consuming the resources on those. So in this case, we do know it is that check destination service, but we can go ahead and dive into these. So here we see at this time point right here, CPU saturation in this host is at 100%. So this is consuming all the resources it could on that ESXi host and on its host itself. We can trace this back to those consuming processes as well. And we're kind of doing a roundabout way to get into this individual performance degradation. And of course, we could go straight into it from that page, but there's always other ways we can dive into the problem and see some more details around this. And of course, again, Easy Travel VMware demo. The business backend is consuming all of our resources at that time point on this host. This is our culprit here, consuming all those CPU resources. And then from here, we can go ahead and dive into that process. And here in this case, we can see this one was actually shut down a little bit ago, but it was consuming all those resources on that host. In this case, it's one process. So here's all of our details about this. So we have its exe path. So if you're kind of curious who owns this, you can dive back into it that way. And that's kind of one of the things we could do with this. So a lot of different ways we can go about this. And we can even go back to that ESXi host, see some of those details. So there's some, appears to be some noisy neighbor issues here in this case, consuming a lot of those resources on that host for this particular issue.
Ben, I really appreciate you taking the time and walking us through this example specifically, because it's not one of the examples that we've seen before on getting to know Dynatrace. And so drilling down into that vCenter and then drilling down into that ESX cluster, that is just fabulous, Ben. Thank you very much for that. And so, folks, when it comes to monitoring the underlying hypervisor, which is basically what Ben is showing us here, we're pulling some of the metrics directly from connecting to your vCenter. So you just basically point Dynatrace at that vCenter. So long as you've got the credentials, Dynatrace will then start ingesting metrics from that vCenter, from that hypervisor, which is the word that we use in the industry. And then what happens is Dynatrace starts including it as part of its underlying monitoring model. And as Ben showed us, when there is a problem, you can drill in and you can see exactly what's going on that vCenter, on that ESX cluster, what's happening down at the individual VM level. And, Ben, you used the term noisy neighbor. Can you explain that one to us? Because that's at the crux of a lot of issues. Go ahead and explain to us what does it mean by a noisy neighbor?
Sure. Yeah, in the modern world, we have a lot of resources and processes and workloads out there that all share some sort of physical hardware of some sort, whether it's in the cloud somewhere or on some sort of VMware host, like as you see in this case. And they have a limited number of resources on those hosts that can be used if you go down all the way down to the bare metal there. So if somebody is really CPU intensive or very hungry for resources, that could be what we call a noisy neighbor, causing your application to have a degradation performance because something else is consuming those resources on that host, whether it's CPU or memory or something like that.
Got it. So what you're saying is that if I've got a server, there's only so much memory on that server. There's only so much CPU processing time on that server. And so you're telling me that something could be running on that server that's chewing up all of my CPU or chewing up all my memory. And that basically means that other things that are running on that system are getting starved. They can't access that because something else is consuming it, right?
Exactly. Something's got to give, right? There's only so
Yeah.
much of it to go around.
Yeah, if resources were infinite, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But that's not the case, is it? Resources aren't infinite. You can't. And on top of it, resources are expensive. As cheap as computing is today, it still costs money. And so the problem is that we see this noisy neighbor type scenario happen all the time, and Dynatrace is just uniquely situated in its visibility to be able to point out those types of scenarios. So Ben, we got another question here. I don't know if let's try this. Can we demonstrate a synthetic transaction to validate an app end to end and demonstrate having application occur to resolve a problem card? So let's go back to the problem card and let's see if it does actually reference synthetic transaction. I'm trying to think. Does this one?
I don't think this one does.
No.
We could probably try and find a different one.
Yeah, let's have a quick look for one. So, folks, while Ben's looking for an example of a synthetic transaction, let me talk a little bit about synthetics. So, synthetics, from Dynatrace's perspective, is effectively little software robots. So, I've got a army of little R2D2s out there that I can basically give them a set of instructions and say, hey, go do this. Now, that set of instructions could be anything really. You could give our synthetics an instruction in terms of, hey, go check out this API. Make a request to this API and look for the response. And if I've got a valid response, good. If I don't have a valid response, fail that test. Put up your hand and say, oh, we got a problem. So that's a very, very simple sort of, type of synthetic test. But a synthetic test could be more in depth. I could say, hey, software robot, go to this page every 5 minutes and make sure the page is loading right and bring me back a whole bunch of information about how this page is loaded. Or a more sophisticated synthetic transaction is go to this page, log in, search for something, do something, then log out. You can go through an entire business flow with the synthetics and mimic the way that an end user actually would do something. So Ben's actually found an example of what our synthetics looks like when it's attached to or identified an issue that's part of a problem. So let's go through that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So right away here, we can see that there's an issue with the synthetic browser in this case. Had our affected locations, affected events there. We can see right away the errors associated with this. So there's a validation for the text on the page, and that match has failed during that time period, causing this one to fail as well. So right away, we can see here that this synthetic monitor is failing during that time period. And we can dive into this and see what is actually happening here with this synthetic monitor and some of the details around that in this case. So here's our test, and we can even browse through all the different screenshots so we can see what this test is expected to do. So we can see it goes through the website, tries to find, looks like some bookings for Paris, and for a few different people kind of browsing through this. So it goes through this whole flow to actually do a booking for that and enter in those details to book that journey. So that's what this test is supposed to be doing, but we can see that during this time period, there are a few different failures that happen there across all the different locations during that time period. And we can dive into these issues. So we can analyze the availability for this. We can track the errors. So we can see that the validate text has failed during that time period. And we can go ahead and browse into this and see, kind of what exactly happened during those time periods, which tests and steps failed. So here's all of our different failures that happened there. And we can even view those individual executions and see what happened during a time period, what the page actually showed during that. So I was looking for some sort of validation on the page for the credit card submit button, but we can see that it never really happens for this one. So here's the expected result, and here's what we saw during a time period instead. So there's that little bit of a difference there between these two ones, causing it to not allow them to actually go through with this and book that payment there. So this step failed because it had that difference between those. That text wasn't able to be validated on the page. So there's a difference in the page that caused this to happen to prevent users from actually doing that. And we can see here all these details around that as well too.
So Ben, at this point, actually back up to the very first page load on this transaction. So basically just go to, right there, and just go all the way to the beginning and go ahead and scroll down a bit. Because what you see here is that detailed waterfall that Ben showed us before from the real user monitoring. But now, I think, Ben, if you hover over that light blue bar right there, now we have the option of viewing a trace. So if we go ahead and click on that view trace, somebody had asked the question, which was, show me the synthetics, but can we also get more of an end-to-end view? And yeah, absolutely. From the synthetics, it can allow you to drill down into the trace information, what we call our pure path. Pure path is Dynatrace jargon. It's basically how we describe our collections of spans and traces, and whether or not the trace is coming from the Dynatrace agent or if a trace is coming from OpenTelemetry, they're all going to show up here inside of the pure path. And from here, if the transaction is sufficiently long enough, you could go completely end to end by looking at the service flow off of that particular pure path. So that hopefully answers your question about that. I think we had another question, and we're going to get to this other question here. Yeah, thank you very much. What are the security features within Dynatrace? So Dynatrace, as you may or may not know, we actually last year had started a offering what we call Dynatrace AppSec, our application security component. What it basically allows us to do is it allows us to detect vulnerabilities that are running within your code. And Ben, I'll lead you through this, but let's go ahead and click on the AppSec piece right over here. And let's go on the start with the security overview.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
Here we go. So folks, in this particular scenario, what we're looking at is our AppSec sort of overview. And what Dynatrace is doing is it's going out and it's pulling from vulnerabilities coming from an engine called Snyk or Sneak, depends on who you talk to, how you pronounce it. But anyways, we go out to this third-party repository that gives us a list of all of the different vulnerabilities. And then we look to see if those vulnerabilities are actually loaded in memory in your application. And then we provide a report in terms of how dangerous is that vulnerability in your setting. So when we drill down into the vulnerabilities themselves, and go ahead and click on the vulnerability page there. There we go. So what happens here is Dynatrace actually shows us a vulnerability like this first one, remote code execution. Let's go ahead and click on this one. Here, this is Dynatrace is giving this a score of 10. It's as bad as it can get. It can't get any worse than this. And the reason for that is that Dynatrace is aware that, in this case, this vulnerability is running in memory in a particular process. And that particular process has a service that's exposed to the public internet, meaning that someone outside the organization potentially could exploit this. It also is showing that there are sensitive data assets that are within range of this vulnerability. And the nature of the vulnerability is, in this case, is remote code execution 0-day. It's about as bad as you can get, because this would allow a malicious person to actually run or execute a script within your application that could expose, in this case, sensitive data. Really, folks, this view, it's not meant to go out and immediately replace all of the security scanning that you have. It's meant to augment it. And in this case, there's no guessing that's going on here. This is Dynatrace 100% showing that here is a vulnerability that's loaded in memory, that's exposed to the public internet, and there are sensitive data assets in range. What do we mean by that? Just scroll down to the bottom, Ben. If you can, just scroll down to the bottom here. So here, it's actually telling us what are the vulnerable components. It's showing us the container images, okay? And if we scroll up just a little bit more, here it's telling us that there's a database that's actually in range of this particular risk or this vulnerability. And so now we have an idea as to what database is in range, what applications are exposed, what services are also, potentially, vulnerable now. So Dynatrace is just giving the security team answers as to what we're observing. And this is, we're the whole Log4j thing that happened before the holidays, and just recently the Spring Shell issue. These conversations are just, we're having more and more of them all the time, and teams are starting to realize that, wow, Dynatrace isn't just for performance management. Dynatrace can also help me make sure my applications are secure. So, hey, listen, folks, we're coming up against the end of the hour, and really, really appreciate all of the input today. Appreciate all of the questions. Hey, Ben, thank you so much for walking us through this demonstration. That was fabulous. I loved how you walked us through the example on the vCenter. I hadn't had anyone do that before, so that was just fabulous. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Well, we'll make sure that we have you back. So again, thanks, Ben. And folks, thank you very much for your questions. And with that, we're going to sign off for this session of Getting to Know Dynatrace. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time for the next session of Getting to Know Dynatrace. And with that, folks, have a great day. Happy Cinco de Mayo to everyone. I've got a Corona with my name on it waiting for me. So with that, folks, take care. Have a good day.
Thank you.